Hello. Hello, good morning, everyone. So thank you for coming to the 2023 UNC Healthcare Business Conference. I'm Yuki Okota, VP of the Healthcare Conference and Asian Healthcare Executive VPs of the Healthcare Club. I will hand it over to Asian.
Thank you. So we're so excited to have you all here today. The conference team has gathered 23 experts from all areas of the healthcare sector for 6 important discussions revolving around this year's themes, what's driving healthcare prices. We'd like to take a second and thank our sponsors, Acadia, Humana, ABIG, Healthcare Advisors, Amgen, Bristol Myers Squibb, Eli Lilly, Iron Health, NC Biotechnology Center, and NC Healthcare Association for making this all possible. Now we'll hand it over to Faculty Director of the UNC Center for the Business of Health and Keenan Flagler Business School Senior Associate Dean of Strategy and Academics, Brad Stotts, to get us started.
Great. Thanks, guys. I want to offer my welcome to this phenomenal group. On behalf of Dean Mary Margaret Frank, the entire school, we are thrilled to kick off today's conference. This is an event that started many years ago, kind of small, student-focused, and has grown over time as we've brought in more and more stakeholders wrestling with the biggest issues around healthcare. As we think about, kind of these fundamental challenges as we address the business side and bring together very intentionally all of the elements that we need if we're going to improve health, right, which is our fundamental goal as we tackle things today. Throughout the day, as they're mentioning, we've got a number of compelling kind of panels, keynotes, as we think about this challenge of prices. And I want kind of, as you're listening, as you're asking questions, everybody to be kind of wrestling and trying to think about, well, what is it that prices are doing here? How are they helping us? How are they getting in the way? Where is it that we need to be thinking about costs? We had a great discussion about that with a group yesterday, and how that's a fundamental input to the story. We're all here for different reasons, but I think this idea of how do we improve health and how do we use business to do that is a current that runs across all of it. I want to thank a number of key folks in terms of groups that set us up for success. As you just saw, our healthcare club, MBA Healthcare Club, is a driving force behind all that we're doing today and beyond. The Center for the Business of Health, and I'll call out Erin Leach in particular, wherever she's hiding. She'll get lots of kudos today, but is absolutely the one making this happen. There we go. Thank you, Erin. And also grateful to the Keenan Institute of Private Enterprise helping us put on today's events, in particular sponsoring our lunchtime keynote, where we're really excited to show Duke and UNC can get along as we think about improving healthcare. But it is my pleasure to get to kick things off with our first panel here that I'll be moderating our morning keynote session. So we're going to be talking about the rising price of drugs in the US. I can kind of feel the shock as I say that with Marcus kind of throwing up his hand, Marcus Saba, for those who know him, say, but we're only 10%. So he is right. It is only 10% of US healthcare costs. So there are lots of elements that we're going to cover this morning and throughout the day as we think about how we do better. At the same time, 10%, still a real number, right? That we want to address. So our panelists are far more accomplished than myself, which is why I need to shut up and ask them a question and get out of the way. But they are Amanda Fories. She's a partner at Magnolia Market Access. We have Fazia Hussain, a vice president of public policy at McKesson, and Francis Nahas, our chief strategy officer at Red Sail Technologies. So to get things going, why don't we start with Amanda, and then we can maybe hear from all three of our panelists. So the overall spend on prescription medication is growing, while at the same time we see more, hopefully cheaper, generics entering the market. And so can you talk a little bit about kind of what's driving these increases and the trends that you're seeing sort of to set the stage for our discussion?
Sure. So hi, everybody. Thank you for having me today. So I've worked a lot in rare specialty disease, the big blockbuster medications, then the generics coming to market. And now we have a world of biosimilars, which is kind of that mid-price point drug that, a lot of these products come into the market. And when a drug goes generic, it's a great thing for the industry. It's a tough thing for the company who invented had the first patent. But the way the system is set up is usually the price of those generics is so incredibly low that insurance companies literally cannot not accept them, right? But what's happening on the back end is there's a lot of rebating and a lot of money. There's a great paper I was going to recommend if people want to look into it called Follow the Dollar. It's a pharma trade association paper. And what it does is it talks about all the things on the back end and how all the money goes between a manufacturer, the plans who cover the drugs, and basically what price you see ends up being the net price, after all these people get their kind of cut on the system. And looking at those two types of products and then bringing biosimilars into the market that come at about a 40 to 50% discount off of the branded products, they've really disrupted the system, and they've made people think we still have a generic type product that's very expensive. We still have to figure out all this rebating and contracting. So as you're kind of getting this market, there's so many people on the back end that are getting the money. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later and give everyone else a chance to speak. But there's a lot of back end that's going on. And you bring yourself into this position where no one really is accessing, or a patient isn't able to say, hey, I want to be on generic Humira. They don't have that kind of transparency. So we have a system set up that, yes, the generics are there. Yes, they're getting covered. Yes, we have products at the top that are still getting covered, but the costs overall are still rising, and it's rising because of the way everything works behind the scenes. So a lot of people that, when I tell them, oh, I run a pharmaceutical economics and policy consulting shop, and I set drug prices, and I set a price for a drug that's on the market that's $300,000 a year, I get this dirty look like you're a horrible person. And I said, no, you don't understand how the pie gets cut up across that product and what ends up ultimately happening. And I'm sure a lot of you here are interested in also like hospital work and maybe being an administrator at a hospital. It's the same way. The hospital has their markup of what they're hoping to charge for a service, but then what their true costs and what they end up actually getting paid are very different. So I think we have a very dark and opaque system that really, if we could scratch it and start all over again with the US healthcare system, I think if we had that more open pricing and who's getting what, we'd be able to really control those costs. But, I don't think generics are able to really move the dial as much as people hope.
Okay, awesome. Fuzzy.
This is on. Great. I agree with you completely. I think the hardest part is trying to explain how the rebates and price concessions that most consumers aren't even aware of, like how they're influencing drug prices. They can, motivate manufacturers to increase their list price, which, just like when you're buying a car, I always like to tell folks it's kind of a similar thing where on your car, right, you see the little tag that says the manufacturer's suggested price. It's $10,000, or I guess in today's market, I'm so $50,000. Yeah, $50,000. My daughter's here. I can see she's going to roll her eyes and be like, $10,000, Mom, forget it. A $50,000 car, but that's the suggested price, right? And then you negotiate down with the dealership to a price, right? That's more in your budget, more in line. Drug prices kind of work in the same way in terms of what the manufacturer sets as their list price, but what the consumer ends up paying is very different. That's more aligned with the net price. So there's a lot of complexity that goes in there. And when folks do talk about this, what's happening with rising drug prices, I always tell them, I was like, well, we have to figure it out. Are you talking about the list price, which is not impacting everybody's paying price, or are you talking about the patient, right? Patient cost sharing is really what's increasing substantially in this country. And that's where, on our day-to-day, you're feeling that pressure. And even though it is 10%, the cost sharing for those drugs, right, is much higher than when you're thinking about an inpatient stay, when you're getting a hip replacement or a cardiac surgery. And I think that's really where those burdens come to play and the scrutiny comes to play appropriately. So,
yeah. Francis?
Yeah, I would echo everything that they said. So I always think if you walk into a pharmacy and you buy, say, a candy bar, right, it feels like a retail transaction. And so we want to understand the market as like, oh, there's a wholesaler, they set a wholesale price, the retailer buys it, they mark it up, they sell it to a consumer at a retail price. that is absolutely so far from what happens in pharmacy. Like you can't even begin to start. So everything they said, we have this like complex web where I think that it's like the pharmacy and the patient have almost no influence over what the price of that drug is. It's negotiated by a third party with a third party, right? It's all the things Amanda and Fausia said. So it's just like, if you look at the market, it is hard to understand it if you try to apply kind of a traditional retail model on pricing. And the other thing that I would say that comes into it is so the third party with the third party is the PBM with the pharma companies, right? Who are doing this negotiation on what pricing ends up, and they're doing it on behalf of somebody else and for somebody else, and it's this web. But the PBM looks at a formulary, which is just the list of all the drugs they're going to cover, and they're going to do that on behalf of a payer who's looking at what are my costs over a group of a population. So Red Cell Technologies, right? We have hundreds of employees. We're self-insured. If you're an employee and you go fill a prescription, we pay most of that. The patient doesn't. We pay most of that. So when we work with our PBM, we're looking at what's our overall cost across this whole formulary of drugs. We're not always thinking what's Sharon pay and what's Joe going to pay for this one drug or these two chronic drugs. And so that's the other layer that comes in here. So when we think about the cost of biosimilars or the cost of, this one really specialty med or what the cost of generic is, you're rarely in the market thinking about it as a point cost. You're thinking about it across a bundle of sort of what's all the potential drugs you could pay. And so it makes it really complex, but it feels really different when you're the patient. You just have to go in and it's sort of what's your out-of-pocket cost. So there's just layers and layers of complexity that go into how things are priced.
Yeah.
Am I allowed to? Oh, I'm sorry.
Please,
Go ahead.
yeah,
No, no.
please.
I was going to have my nerd out
You're the
second.
panelist. You get to
And
do whatever you want.
This is a little bit
Yeah.
of a nerd out, but I promise I'm coming to a place on the end. So just give me like 2 minutes. Okay. So under the medical benefit, so when you go to a hospital or a physician's administering something, the hospital, the payer, everyone has figured out an average sales price. So I'm going to just talk Medicare for a second. Every manufacturer at the end of each quarter, they're sending into the Medicare program. Here's all the drugs we sold. Here's all the discounts we gave. And here's our weighted average, our average sales price. So it's extremely transparent. So if they give payer this or hospital this or whatever, a discount, it's reflected in what their average sales price is. And most payers pay based on average sales price. So Medicare pays ASP plus 6. Some payers ASP plus 20. They're basing things off ASP, but that price is public. That price is out there. It's very transparent. And because of that, you've really got a hold on what the true cost is for ultimate purchasers in the medical benefit. On the pharmacy side, it doesn't work that way. On the pharmacy side, this is where you have that opaque world where drug company went and negotiated a different contract with Optum, a different contract with CVS and all those things. And it's not affecting, and I'm not actually publishing that. You do have like 340B discounts you have to give. You have this whole Medicaid drug pricing rebate program and a lot of that, but your actual per volume weighted price isn't going out to people. So when that patient goes to fill the drug, they're paying their cost share off the list price. But the payer on the back end is saying, oh, okay, well, I pay my share and then I go back and I get that 40 and 50% rebate, or sometimes an 80% rebate. And companies like AbbVie, for example, Humira went biosimilar, but they've still had a really huge share on the market. And it's because they're able to go into a PBM and say, as you said, a whole formulary management process. They say, look, we're going to give you discounts on a whole bunch of different products. It's going to cover all your patients. It's going to save you this, where biosimilar manufacturer isn't able to do that. And because of that, they're kind of keeping a hold on the market, and it's not coming out and being publicly shared, and it's not being shared based on the patient's cost share. So not having those rebates kind of at that point of sale, not having everything happen there really adds to the complexity that sometimes the patient pays a copay that's higher than what the drug even costs because they're getting such good rebates on the back end. So I think having a transparent system, kind of like that ASP model on the medical side, if we could move something like that to the pharmacy, that would help considerably, because the payers just want to keep getting that rebate and there's no end to the spend for them. So they have to keep going to pharma, and then pharma has to keep raising their prices to account for the rebates. Sorry, it came full circle.
Yeah, no, it did, and
The
yeah,
takeaway is rebates.
Yeah.
Just look up rebates after this.
and transparency.
And transparency.
So I mean, I think as we look at this, right, there's this element that is behavioral. Part of why pharma gets so much attention is that we're going to, the pharmacy more frequently. We are having to pay out of pocket, and so this element of just it's in front of us more than hopefully for most people, the hospital visit that's much more money, but is far less frequent. But there's also, as you all are highlighting, this complexity, and we kind of are hoping in this panel to peel some of that back, right, as we understand what's going on, and then maybe some thoughts on how we can do better. Kind of a theme throughout the day, and this is part of the different panels, is as we look at this, everybody's got a different perspective. I love folks have heard me say before, Brian Cavaney's comment from LabCorp that one party's waste is another party's profit. And so we want to be putting kind of those lenses on throughout as we realize, okay, this all helps us sometimes coordinate the system well, sometimes get in the way. But if we get to this point of how do we understand some more about what's going on in kind of the mechanics, if we look at the data, Americans pay more on average for kind of branded prescription drugs, individual drugs, than other countries, and so at least most. And so maybe Amanda, you could start with, can you talk a little bit about why these prices differ, and then I'll throw in the harder question of, is it fair?
Nothing is fair. Just anyone who's still bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, coming out of school, changing the world, you're saying that you haven't been jaded yet. Nothing's fair in the system. Okay, so this is going to change significantly in the next 10 years. So what I'm about to say, I think, will be a completely different story if you had me here 10 years from now, which you probably won't invite me back after this. But the whole idea around other countries is other countries have set up the policy where you're going and putting a value proposition and a cost effectiveness perspective to a drug. So in the EU, here's an analysis on the benefit that this product is provided, and then they're setting the price. They don't have a whole back-end rebate. The country's paying, it's out there, it's transparent. In the US, each individual company is setting those different price points and different rebates. So at the end of the day, because that's on that back end and that's not a publicly disclosed thing, you're seeing those costs go up. Now, is one fair? Is one not? Well, we also have a healthcare system where I'm not waiting 9 months to get into a doctor's office for my care that I need, right? Like other countries have had to ration care a lot more. And in addition to that, when you look at Canada, when you look at the UK, they have the federal or the government insurance that they provide, and then employers are still having to supplement on top of that and give people additional insurance because the system alone is not able to handle the financial needs of the population. So we have a huge safety net here in the US. We have the Medicare program, but we don't have a place where we all have insurance. Plus my employer has to give me something second because I have to be rationed more. So it comes with pros and cons, right? Do you either have a system where everything's being set, everything's controlled, and patients maybe wait longer? They might not get as innovative of treatments because maybe the government didn't deem that that product is worth that extra price, and now they're not going to let it come to market. Or do you say, okay, we're in the system here where we have care, you have drug companies giving away a lot of free drug, they're using copay cards, we have all these different ways that people are getting care to patients, but yes, we have a higher cost to it. So I think there's a balance there, and we have to figure out what's right for us. And like I said, if we could erase it all and come out like when I buy my car insurance and I'm purchasing my car insurance, I would love to just say, hey, I want to buy healthcare and I need this is what's my price. But we're in such a system where our employer purchases it. And, it's just so convoluted the way we get benefits that we just can't really seem to break the cycle.
Great. Either one of you want to chime in on that one?
Yeah, I'll chime in. I think we get this question a lot, especially from the policy world, because there's been a push, every year to find different ways of reducing drug prices and, shifting to a reference pricing model where we would benchmark US prices to other countries has come up repeatedly, especially in Congress. And I think one of the biggest challenges is really going deeper to understand how are our healthcare systems different, and then can you appropriately benchmark? And a lot of that difference is the way in which our health insurance is structured. That's a huge piece. And I also think that as a society, right, we have to think about, are we willing to move to a world in which we're using quality adjusted life years, where you are doing some sort of a metric that says, we're going to price a drug or evaluate its cost effectiveness based on one life year, and then put a number to it. So there are different groups in the US who do that today. If you've heard of ICER and others, they do the analysis, and it's $100,000. And it goes down the older you get in terms of the value of a drug to your life. I just don't think we're there as a country. We like our independence, and what someone may think is valuable to one is not valuable to the other. And quantifying the patient value is a huge challenge. It's a big area of research. It's incredibly critical, but not enough folks are investing in it because it's hard to do. Because how do we try to standardize value? Is it being able to brush your teeth? Is it being able to walk 10 steps? Depends on your disease, depends on your condition, depends on your family support. What does that mean for you if you can do that? Can you live independently, right? Without having to go to a nursing home. There's a lot of different factors that come into, determining value. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges we have is when we look outside of the US, they're more focused sometimes on the quality adjusted life year. They have a national budget that they're working towards. So there's definitely pros and cons, but that's also one of the reasons why we get access to innovation faster. And then we'll hopefully talk about some of the things that might change our access to innovation that's getting folks up in arms today. And that's nothing when we think about benchmarking to countries that are using quality adjusted life years.
Anything you want to add?
Nope.
Okay. Awesome. That's an acceptable answer. Yeah, no, I mean, I do think the fairness point is a fascinating one, and how you frame it. Is it a one-to-one comparison? Is it also hey, net better off? And so if that's the case, then is it fair? Well, it's letting us get some of this innovation that you're talking about, even if there are places we can still maybe tweak and do a little bit better. So Fauzi, I want to open up, kind of a big topic here for you. That The Economist, many of you may have seen recently, had an article that was talking about kind of rising healthcare costs in the U.S. And they focused a lot on kind of the middlemen in the prescription drug market. So kind of everybody's favorite group right now to bash as we think about kind of PBMs. They talked more broadly about kind of just the size of companies in general, right? That we have kind of a huge number of companies that make up Fortune 50 or so. We can think about folks like a United, CVS, Cigna, McKesson, AmerisourceBergen, Cardinal, some that we know well on this panel. So, if we look at these distributors, the PBMs, payers, pharmacies in the US, how do you think about kind of this size, this consolidation? And I think now this starts to get us into some of that murkiness of what's going on behind the scenes. So kind of unpack it for the group.
How much time do we have?
Yeah.
We could be here all day talking about middlemen. I almost want to send this question back to Frances because I think she may have crafted it.
I know.
But it's a good question. The middleman question is very it's difficult to go deep on very quickly, but I'm going to do my best to talk about it. So first of all, not all middlemen are created equal. And when we're using the term middleman, it's usually any entity in the supply and the reimbursement chain that's impacting the drug that the manufacturer is developing, getting it from the manufacturer down to the patient. And I would think about it in two segments, right? You've got the distribution part of the supply chain. That's literally packing, picking, moving, shipping the product, right? That's what distributors do. It's one of the things that McKesson does, right? So we move the product from the manufacturer down to the pharmacy, for example. We are not impacting drug price. We are just moving the product down the supply chain. We are not impacting patient access or cost sharing. That's one part of the supply chain, right, that we're talking about. The other is the reimbursement side. The reimbursement side is what we spent a lot of time talking about this morning. That reimbursement side is, how is the patient accessing it? How is the provider getting paid for it? And the cost sharing for the patient, their financial burdens. That's the part of our supply chain in healthcare delivery that is impacting, what I would say is access, price, and everything else. So not all middlemen are created equal. So there are a bunch that are just moving the product. Then there's a bunch that are impacting access and affordability. And I think the middleman conversation that we're seeing more today is on that second part, which is the access and affordability piece. That's really where the PBMs fit in. And a lot of that opaqueness that we're talking about here gets compounded when you do think about consolidation in the marketplace, because that means there are fewer people making those determinations for larger volumes of patients. So that's, I think, like a key distinction. And I'd say on the distributor side of the house, sometimes consolidation is a good thing. You can build to scale and efficiency. And when you're looking at that part of the supply chain, because I know where Francis is going to go next, you're talking like razor thin margins. You're talking 1% or less. And it's a competitive market. Your incentive on this side is to be as efficient as you can, to truly be almost as cheap as you can, because that's part of your value proposition to the stakeholders in the supply chain. You want to be able to move things quickly. You want to be able to move them cheaply. And that's where I would say consolidation can actually have significant value, because scale can bring efficiency.
I would absolutely echo that. So I joke about the distributors are like, they're 1% margin businesses. It's razor thin margin. And if you've taken maybe Brad's operation class here, right? Like economies of scale are real and valuable, right? You drive efficiency, you can drive costs down in the system. The challenge with consolidation is, in my opinion, right? It's on the other side, and it's because of the opaqueness, right? So it's not just that consolidation is bad, it's consolidation with this like inability to see what's happening in there. And, one of the things I talk about that a lot of folks don't realize has happened over the last couple of years even is we have hundreds of PBMs in the country. The top three are CVS, so CVS Caremark, Cigna, which owns Express Scripts, and United, which owns Optum. So it's Caremark, Express Scripts, and Optum. They're all owned by the top three payers, medical payers in the country. And all of them have established a GPO, right? And the GPO for those PBMs is the organization that actually does that negotiation with pharma. And so those three PBMs are the biggest, but those GPOs do the negotiation for the vast majority. So like Cigna's GPO also negotiates for Humana, right? So there's more consolidation within that space than even as apparent all the times if you just look at sort of who's the PBM in the world. So you really have kind of three companies that negotiate the vast majority of what those prices are across all of healthcare. And almost, and there's next to no visibility into what they're negotiating or how it's negotiating or what the rebates are, what money do they get that doesn't get passed on to the next player. And so it's not that consolidation is bad, it's kind of this consolidation with the opaqueness that becomes really challenging in a space where there's this sense of sort of people should have access and things should be affordable. So I think that's the thing that we struggle with all the time is there's this sense of public health, of their sort of public value here. And you've got private corporations that have a really kind of black box around the negotiation that happens with pricing.
Can I add real quick?
Yeah.
So I think that the piece of it is also, so it's not just consolidation, it's that vertical integration, right? So it's the misaligned incentives that could get compounded when you have an insurer who owns the PBM, who has the GPO, right?
The pharmacy,
who owns the pharmacy. And, the misaligned incentives are, how do you keep everything in the family, right? How do you create a benefit design, right, that favors the PBM and wait, their in-network pharmacy, which is all part of the same vertical entity.
Yeah.
That creates sort of a compounding effect.
It's not by accident that CVS's pharmacies are sort of in network and get paid a little bit more if it's a CVS Caremark kind of PBM, right? And there's in theory separation, but we're starting to see with some of the stuff that's happening on the Hill, like actually what those prices look like. And I'm like, it's not by accident that happens.
I mean, if you want to.
I would say, the economists, let's talk about PBMs this year. And a year ago, 2 years ago, we were raking pharma across the coals, right? So the Inflation Reduction Act, when that was passed last August, that really, took a hit at payers, but it really took a hit at pharma. A lot of pharma associations really did push that they wanted to help out in catastrophic. They wanted to redesign because that's been one of their biggest issues for patient affordability. They wanted an out-of-pocket maximum. But drug price negotiation, now when you bring a product in and if you raise the price over inflation, you're going to be paying penalties. Those things really took pharma out at the knees last year. And I don't think they were expecting as much of that to pass. And a lot of companies have left trade associations because they're mad about how that all played out. But because of that, you kind of took your swing at pharma, and now this year they're shining that light on PBMs, right? And then next year, who's it going to be, right? We're just kind of moving through the cycles of how to break each group. And then what I think is going to end up happening with the Inflation Reduction Act is now every company, and I talk to companies all the time, that they're like, we now have to launch with a higher price, because what are we going to do? We can't raise our price after. Or the drug price negotiation, if you get selected for negotiation, you or a competitor or a patient group can submit cost effectiveness research. And this is why I said we're going to be a different world 10 years from now, because you can actually fight to either help or hurt what their ultimate negotiated price is at the end if they're selected for negotiation. So we're starting to sneak some of these things in on the pharma side, but I do think PBMs and the PBM reform was actually moving along pretty well this year. I saw yesterday they've reintroduced it, but they're trying to do things like, basically, you can't tie the rebate or certain admin fees to the list price of the drug. It needs to be a flat amount. So you don't only pick really expensive drugs on formulary, all these little back end things. That's where I think they're going to go. I do think it's going to slow down with the election cycle. I don't think things are going to happen as fast as people were hoping. But yeah, they're going to get their beating, and then we'll move on to the next group.
It's like the Three Stooges. You guys can Google that later too, because you might not know, but Three Stooges were really famous for, don't look over here, look over here. It's a lot of finger pointing across the supply chain about who's causing it. And if we're really all truly honest and, friendly, we can say everyone plays a different role, right? There's a lot of contributing factors, and it's not just one entity, but you're right. It is like pointing of the fingers. Don't look here, look over there, which doesn't really serve consumers and our healthcare system well, but it is the world that we're in. And I do want to comment on the IRA piece, the Inflation Reduction Act. The best laid plans, right, can have unintended consequences. So Medicare can negotiate price for drugs for the first time ever, which is amazing. We're going to see, sometimes maybe like 40, 50, 60% off of a drug's list price. And I'll say list price because, again, as we talked about, list to net, gross to net is a little bit of a different story. But the unintended consequences, you basically are shortening the time frame in which a manufacturer has, right, to get their return on investment on a drug that they're launching. Because if you're a Medicare drug and you're on the market for oral drugs 9 years, for biologics 11 years, and you're going to be hitting into those top expenditure rates for Medicare, well, you're a target for negotiation. So to your point, if I am already going to have to launch at a higher price to avoid inflationary penalties, well, now I only have 9 and 11 years, right, to make back that return on investment. So those prices are only going to get higher and higher and higher. And that's kind of like the challenge that we're facing, right? Is like, what are those incentives in the marketplace? And until we can align the incentives, we're going to continue to sort of fix a little bit here, fix a little bit here, but there's going to be more dramatic consequences, which is higher prices and less access to innovation. And I think far less than Congress ever expected, right? I think the Congressional Budget Office said we're going to see 15 less drugs over 10 years. And that may not seem like a lot, but those could be 15 breakthrough drugs, life-saving curative treatments that we miss out on. But what they didn't account for is also the way in which pharma looks at indication sequencing. Like, how quickly do you bring a drug to market? If your clock starts at 9 and 11 years, if you're a pharma company, not only are you looking at the price, I'm also looking at the population, right? So am I going to start in the marketplace with an orphan, smaller population? Well, my clock has started ticking then. Or am I going to wait now until I can get an indication for a larger population so I get bigger bang for my buck right at launch? So what that really can mean is for individuals who have those rare diseases, it might actually delay our access. So it's not just we won't have access to the drug, 15 go off the roster. Now we might have significant delays in accessing innovation.
I have literally had 7 clients in the past 4 months decide to not launch with the smaller indication first because they didn't want the clock to start on their larger one. And they were all things that did not have any like good treatments available. So it's pretty crazy. And I'm not that big of a company, that's 7 small startups, whatever, but with really promising data that have said we're not going to be able to do it. And they're ethically struggling because that was the goal of their company, to bring the product, but they literally can't survive financially if they don't have that full chance to take that on.
We're going to take a question after one more question. So that was going to be my heads up to be ready for questions. But I want to ask Francis a question first, which is, kind of, so we've got the mechanics here. We also are seeing some folks on the kind of company side try to, disrupt the industry. I'm thinking about digital pharmacies, Mark Cuban's cost plus pharmacy, but the large players still dominate, as you highlighted, right?
Yeah.
So you could talk a little bit about, what's needed for real change, and
Yeah.
can policy help?
Yeah. I'm gonna start in a really weird place. Just bear with me. Do you guys remember those like old Nokia phones with like the plastic antennas and if you have no idea what I'm talking about right now because you're too young, don't worry, that's just gonna prove my point. I work for Red Sail Technologies, right? So this should give you a hint on where I'm going. We look at the industry and we have iPhone 16 expectations in an industry that operates on that old Nokia phone, right? Like, and actually that example isn't even extreme enough because in some cases the industry literally operates on technology built in the 90s that's coded in coding languages that were developed in the 70s. So one area, honestly, that like there's a couple things I think we need for innovation. One is it's really hard to innovate on really old infrastructure. And we have really old infrastructure and it anchors us. Like there's this, in software companies, this concept of technical debt, we call it. And it's basically like, what is the cost of having really legacy technology in your system? What does it take to maintain it now that it's old? What does it prevent you from doing? Because you can't do it on the old stuff. So that's one thing I think about a lot because we're a technology company, which is how anchored are we by just the old infrastructure we've got? It's really hard to build a fancy new app and use AI and interface with a mainframe. Right? Like this is challenging. So that's one. I think that the industry is like ripe for technology innovation, which is actually going to help a lot of the other innovation because it'll give you access to data. It'll give you interoperability in a way that we just don't have in the industry today. So that's one. I do think I want to comment on the cost plus pharmacy, what Mark Cuban's doing, because I think it's of all the stuff you read in the industry, like Amazon's getting into pharmacy, like what's that mean? Is it really cool? I think what Mark Cuban's doing is actually one of the most interesting. So if we go back to that retail example I talked about, like that's what he's doing. He's like, I'm going to buy the drug from a wholesaler. I'm going to put a retail markup on it and I'm going to sell it to a consumer. It is that simple. The challenge is that works really well for the like 10% of the market that will pay cash. But he's still got to go up against the PBMs for the rest of the market that pays through insurance typically. And those PBMs have really tight relationships with those wholesalers that are going to sell that drug or really with the manufacturer also. So there's going to be friction there in the market. And I think that's where actually you get into, I do think there's some policy things that can help if there's a push for more transparency around the pricing. So I think that's the thing that holds a lot of folks back. I mean, I've been in the space for over a decade. And, the number of times I've tried to make a PowerPoint slide that like tracks where the money goes and who's negotiating to who. And then like, I just give up because I'm like, there's no way to make this pretty. Like I can't fit it on a slide. It's really challenging, and having more transparency about that's going to allow folks who are really innovative to come in and say, well, I can do something here that just like totally streamlines this whole section of space. But it's hard to do that when you don't know what the what is.
Awesome. Let's open it up to questions for a little bit. And do I have a microphone over here to carry? No, I'll borrow yours, Francis. Can I borrow your microphone? Awesome. So please start us off.
This is so perfect. Okay, the onion, if we don't start peeling it, it's just getting thicker and thicker and thicker. So you mentioned Mark Cuban's program. Maybe you guys could talk about alternative funding programs. And what way this works is that like an alternative funding program says to a payer, exclude all of these drugs, which are costing you $30 million for like 3,000 people. Exclude all of these specialty drugs. Now your employee is non-insured, and we're going to take that employee and we're going to get them their drugs through a PAP, patient assistance program. Now, does that sound ethical? Okay. Or we're going to get it through Mark Cuban. We're going to buy it through him. We're going to buy it through all these other channels directly. And if we can't get it, or the PAP says, no, that doesn't sound right, we're going to get it from another country. And then the company is going to pay me, the alternative funding program, and money. But we're going to save you, the company, so much money because you paid $30 million for those 3,000 people on those specialty drugs. So as the prices go up, the temptation's higher and higher. About 9% of employers or payers right now are saying, yeah, that sounds good. And 30% are looking at it because it's so expensive. Now, is it ethical? Does the patient, is that what the patient assistance program is for? To have people who have jobs and insurance and a PBM and so forth, but now they're being excluded. So they're saying you don't have insurance for these medications. It's very icky. And Mark Cuban's, he that wasn't his intention, but these alternative funding programs are buying it from him. And if they can't get it from a patient assistance program, they get it through foundation or a grant, which is like this, but you can't find out what that is because it's a 501(c) or whatever. I mean, it's just really getting ickier and ickier as the prices go up because payers are getting squished so hard.
Awesome.
I mean, I'm happy to start it because, you know, at McKesson, we have a number of access and adherence solutions and programs, and, you know, we operate a number of patient assistance programs and foundation programs. So it's near and dear to our heart. You know, I think what you're getting at is a huge gap in the healthcare ecosystem, which is, again, it's our insurance design, right? And we have an insurance system that can allow for these drugs to be determined or deemed non-essential, right? And make the patient appear as if they don't have insurance. You know, this issue around like the use of accumulators, you know, maximizers, which create disincentives for patients to use assistance programs or alternative funding models effectively is a huge challenge. And it's one I do think that we need to address because, you know, when you're talking about patient out-of-pocket costs and whether they're counting towards their, you know, out-of-pocket maximums as established by the Affordable Care Act, it shouldn't matter where the source of funding is coming from. It shouldn't matter if I'm paying for it cash or if George is giving me $20 or if it's a manufacturer who's giving me $50, right? We should be able to count everything towards a patient's cost sharing like their cost sharing limits. That's number one. Number two is we have to look at insurance design and see how do we get through some of these loopholes that allow these drugs that are life-saving and critical to be deemed non-essential, and therefore, as you just said, that make you look like you're not insured for them. So there's a number of places here I think that we need to tweak the system. It's that out-of-pocket cost. It is the definition of essential meds, and how does that inform how we're looking at health plans and their formularies and their coverage policies? But it's a huge problem.
It is. I would also say two things in that particular question. So one, a lot of plans are already looking at, and it doesn't have to be a very expensive specialty. You can actually go the other direction and say the really cheap generic and saying, actually, are there ways on the medical plan side, so the payer side, to say, hey, patient, actually use this discount card, don't use your insured plan, because you can get that generic for a cheaper price than actually what's been funded for us on the formulary from my PBM. So that's happening at the low end of the market too. It's not sort of patient assistance, but how do we find kind of alternate ways? And we can have an entire side conversation around what's happening with cash payments, because most of that folks don't realize rolls up to the PBMs also. But that's happening at the low end of the market too. On the high end of the market, the specialty end of the market, I think it's also really important to look at sort of what's the economics of how that specialty med gets dispensed. Like most there's no official definition, we'll start with, for what a specialty med is thing A, right? Most often it's just how expensive it is, or the pharma company actually limits the distribution. And so the largest specialty pharmacies in the country are also all owned by those same PBM companies that we've listed. Like every one of them, they got pressure on rebates, so they invested in mail order pharmacies. They got pressure on mail order pharmacies, so they invested in specialty pharmacies, right? These are public companies. They're going to find a way to deliver growth and profit to their shareholders, right? And so when we think about kind of the cost of the specialty meds or excluding them, it's not just how you pay, it's kind of who you pay and how much it costs. Like what's the access to them is a really important part of that conversation. I think we're only looking at one half of the ecosystem if we're thinking about sort of the insurance and who pays. Would be my comment.
Great, thanks. Time for one more question. Make it a good one. Little pressure on the group. Okay, awesome.
First of all, thank you all for being here. I work in IQVIA Market Access Group, so everything you said preaches to my day-to-day and the challenges we have in thinking through a lot of these things. I'm currently taking a class with Dr. Adam Brown, and co-driven by Brad Stats here, so gonna trip to them for a little bit. But we talk a lot about PBMs in our space of like maybe they're the driving factor or part of the problem. There are a lot of people, to your point, that are driving it, but with all the focus now from the Hill on PBMs, transparency, if I could maybe ask all three of you, is there a particular bill or proposed bill that you're seeing that maybe has the most potential of changing things, right? Because there's 6 or 7 different bills submitted by different committees across the Hill. So is there a particular one that you think is going to be the most effective or maybe the most likely to pass, right? Understood there's some delays from the last couple of weeks and not having a speaker in the House, but is there one that comes to mind that is going to help solve things or help go things in the right direction?
I'm happy to start, I guess, being head of public policy. It's a good place to be, but it's a really good question. So one I'll say is there might be 6 different bills, but they all generally look very similar, right? It's like the same flavors with little variations on the end. So that's one piece. So I would say if you're looking at which one is likely to rise to the top, it's probably going to be the latest package from Senate Finance that came out yesterday. That's like number one. Number two, do I think any of them solve the problem? No, 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 and no. 100% no. And as a patient advocate, it's very disappointing because we do use the term PBM reform, and really what these bills are, they're more PBM transparency, right? They're not addressing a number of the loopholes that we're talking about. It's essentially asking the PBM to be more transparent with the plan sponsor on how they're developing their formularies, how much they're spending on drugs, getting better clarity into those rebates and price concessions. There's very few places, right, that they're mandating change. We talked about one of them, right, which is like moving away from percentage-based fees to flat fees, which, it's a step in the right direction, but it doesn't close a majority of the challenges that we've highlighted. So I think they're very disappointing from a patient's perspective. They don't create significant savings either, and that's played out with the Congressional Budget Office scoring them to say these are nominal savings. So are you really reforming an industry if you get basically 0 savings out of it? Probably not. But what I think it does is it sets the stage next year for greater activity. And I don't know that activity happens until the Federal Trade Commission or the FTC releases its findings from its PBM investigation. I think that's where you start to better understand what are potentially those misaligned incentives and business models that are creating the problem. And once you can understand that, that's where Congress can come back and start to find more effective solutions.
Yeah, so my firm, we do a lot of, I've actually met with the FTC several times recently in the Congressional Budget Office because we do a lot of scoring for trade associations to figure out what do these bills end up being, a savings or a cost or whatever to the federal government. And I think you hit the nail on the head, the FTC investigation on, what's going on with vertical integration. How are these PBMs getting too powerful? What do they used to say, too big to fail for the banks? Or how are we getting to that point? That's definitely a big one. The interesting thing with that is you're saying delinking fees. It's like basically all the manufacturers are going to do is have to pay it somewhere else. So you're going to take a fee and say, okay, if your drug, we get 5% of the cost of your drug and an admin fee. Now it can only be $200. Well, a drug company is going to say, well, guess what? I just got asked to add 10% to my rebate or whatever my drug cost is to make up for that. So you're really just squeezing the balloon on one end and moving it to the other. Where I think some of the biggest, there's like step therapy legislation, I think is a big deal. essentially formulary utilization management tactics, prior authorization, excluding drugs and forcing patients to go through different avenues to get it, the copay accumulators where you're not letting people count the assistance they're getting toward their copay to be able to hit an out-of-pocket maximum, all these different things, and companies that are using rebates to put their drug as a step in front of another drug. It's really the way that we manage the use of products that I think needs to be re-examined, and where I think the good thing about the IRA, which it's very hard to say that because there's a lot of crazy stuff about it, but we are going to be shining some light on that through people submitting this health economic information. Like, we're actually finally going to force people to do a little bit more of a head-to-head on how is this drug going to really truly help the population. I don't think cost effectiveness is great from the quality perspective, but I think it's great from an outcomes analysis. And we interview payers all the time, and they're like, hey, this is the 80,000th anti-inflammatory drug I've seen on formulary this year. Where's the head-to-head comparator? And like, no pharma company is doing a head-to-head comparator. They can't. Like, it's costs too much money. The FDA doesn't require it. But what if they did and they said this drug is actually more effective, or that wouldn't we have a much easier formula? I don't want to put a price on like my mom's life when she's trying to get her blood thinners, right? But I'd like to know that the drug she's using was priced appropriately for the clinical benefit. So I think trying to get away from this criteria that's based on the money and based more on the clinical efficacy of the product, to me, is even more important than how we're cutting fees around and how we're making money on the back end from people.
I am not I don't have like a fraction of the policy expertise of the two people sitting next to me. So I'm just going to take two things. We operate as though it's never going to happen, right? Like the federal government and sort of what's going to happen in Congress is just moves so slowly that I think, at least for us, we look at the industry and what we're trying to do, and we've got to do it without the assistance of the federal government, is sort of the frank answer on our part. The other thing that I would say is, in addition to what's happening kind of in Washington, it's also really important to look at sort of what happens in each individual state. So I think we forget sometimes that we actually run healthcare by state. Insurance is done state by state. There's state boards of pharmacy, there's state locations. And so there's a lot in healthcare that's actually driven at a state level, not just a national level. And so we follow some of the things that happen kind of state by state as well, where there's lawsuits and legislation passing. And in some cases, it's you get momentum in the states, and that's where you can actually see something that happens kind of more nationally. So that'd be the other. These two probably know that even more than me. But those are the two things I think about.
Awesome. Thanks, y'all. So last question that kind of a provocative one, I guess, to try to tie all this together. If we look at the healthcare system, we often focus on the large companies, but of course, every player in the system is looking at their profits, amongst other things, that we do fundamentally have a for-profit healthcare system in the United States. And so kind of let me just ask the question and respond to it how you will. How much is too much profit?
That right there's the I was gonna say $1 million question, might be $1 billion question.
Trillion?
$1 trillion. Here's how I think about it. And then like, nobody goes to med school and expects to not be paid to work for free. Nobody goes to pharmacy school and expects that they're just going to work for free for the rest of their life, or nursing school and work for free. Like, there is at the root of healthcare sort of an expectation that there's value in that service. And so I think the tricky question is what is the value and how do you price it? I think the struggle with sort of for-profit companies driving a lot of the healthcare industry is every single one of those for-profit companies has an expectation of what they should deliver from a profit perspective based on the type of business they are. So we joked about kind of McKesson, the distributors, right? They're 1% margin businesses, right? If they're eking out 2% margin, that's great. Wall Street loves that. If you're a pharmacy, you have a different expectation. If you're a pharma company, you have a different expectation. If you're a technology company, you have a different expectation. And so a lot of times those expectations are, this is kind of classic old bits of school, right? Like value for risk, and how do you build that out over time? But it is a really tricky, like that's how most of the companies operate, right? They're not thinking broadly they're thinking sort of what's the expectation for the type of company and product that I am, and how do I deliver value to my shareholders, and how do I continue to grow? So I don't know what the right answer is. I just know that, like, even when you get down to the root, there is a belief, and I think an expectation most of us would have, that, hey, if I go to the doctor, it's appropriate for me to pay for a service that I receive. We've got to balance that against a sort of public health expectation that there's sort of a baseline level of care that people deserve. I don't know.
I don't think any amount of profit is too much profit. I think it's the ethical way you get to it. And I think that's where, if I always say to my husband, you hear on the news, oh, this pharma company took all these people here and they did this and they did that and they're making money. Well, no one gets on the news and says Verizon took all their top salespeople on a business trip, even though we're all paying probably $200 a month. Most of your parents are probably still paying for your cell phone bills. They're not cheap. But that's where no one's complaining about Verizon, because Verizon doesn't have an ethical concern about my well-being, right? They don't have to do that. So I think the entire system needs to ethically think about pricing and ethically think about the value they're bringing. But at the end of the day, when you have a blockbuster drug that you went through 20 other drugs to get it, it's costing you probably $2 billion to get there. Then on top of that, you only have so many years with a patent that's now being shortened. You got to make that money, because then you also have to go get other indications for that drug. You have to invest in other diseases. You have to get to that rare disease product. And someone can tell me right now, well, pharma companies make a lot of money. I work with a lot of companies that, yes, they have money, but they are going through so many molecules to get something for that one rare disease for those 72 people in the US that have it. And you can all say there's no profit, but then the minute that your sister has that one disease, you're pissed off at the industry for not having a drug for it. So I really don't think any amount of profit is too bad. I think there's an ethical issue, and people have to expect that if you want a treatment for that rare drug, we're going to pay for it. But yes, I don't want to hear that a drug company threw a $20 million party for, 8 people. Like, I don't want to hear that, because I think that gets to the point where you're going beyond what the intent of your purpose is.
Awesome. Fazia.
I agree with everything that you all said, and I'll maybe pose it a different way, which is, we're talking about like how much is too much. We're in a drug shortage crisis in many ways. I might say, like, you can see when it's not enough, when it's too low, when drug prices are too low, that there's not an incentive for worthwhile investment in manufacturing. I mean, the headlines that tell you, your cancer drug costs less than a cup of coffee, that we're at a point where, is that too low? And what do we do about that? I think that's where we're talking about, like, the ethical incentives in the supply chain. There is a place where maybe you might feel it's too much, but there's also a significant portion where it's not enough. And because the economic incentives are not enough, we're facing a drug shortage crisis. And we have to actually think about it the other way. Like, what price is too low? And that's a very different place for us to have a conversation, because we focus so much on what's too high. But what's too low is actually driving a number of additional, concerns.
When there's suddenly no saline in a hospital.
That's right.
Because nobody wants to produce it because you can't make enough money.
That's exactly right.
So sadly, we are at time. I want to give a round of applause to Amanda. I think this highlights as well the interdisciplinary nature, the complexity of the system, and I'm excited for the rest of the day as we unpack this real quick. We have breakout panels next. If you want to attend the influence of consolidation on healthcare prices and costs, stay here. AI boom and reducing healthcare prices, hyper reality. Go out to the Keenan Institute over in room 204. Head that way, people will direct you. 10:10, we'll get started with the next panels. Thanks, y'all.